Right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending after what will have been a very, very busy day. And the idea of this session, I know most of you will have come recently to some speech, language and communication training that I've been doing with St. Wilfrid's, where we've really concentrated on this notion of identifying gaps and embedding interventions into our targeted practice. The idea of this fourth session was to give people a chance to find out a little bit more about the Launchpad for Literacy Toolkit, how it can support you, how it can support children, because although the training that we've just delivered didn't need you to have a Launchpad for Literacy Toolkit, that actually having one would make that process of gap identification and embedding interventions just that little bit more specific and that little bit more systematic in order to support our children. So really it's an information sharing session, simply for you to find out a little bit more about what it is, what it's not, and to think about whether it's something that suits the priorities of your school and the needs of your children. So what I'll do is I'll just go through what I think are the main things to talk about, and then at the end I'll leave plenty of time for questions, because I think that's probably the main thing to do. I think the most important thing before we can get into the nitty-gritty of the different applications we can use Launchpad for is to really get across this idea that it's an upskilling toolkit. It is the opposite of an isolated intervention. It's about upskilling you and your team and giving you a sustainable solution to tackle the issues that we have and the gaps that our children have and the issues that we face. So it can be used in lots of different ways, but however you use it, that principle of it being an upskilling toolkit in order to give you a sustainable solution to gap filling and interventions remains the same. What else is a commonality about it? In this upskilling toolkit, it gives you specific and incremental detail of child development. The whole toolkit is underpinned by a skills framework where we break down child development, particularly speech, language and communication development, but also other essential preconditional skills for pre and early literacy. We can see how all of those skills develop, they're plotted out over time, and we can understand how they all fit together. And we all know that the understanding of child development is crucial. But on top of understanding child development, what Launchpad gives you is that ability to understand directly how child development feeds directly into readiness for children to learn or to do different things, which we'll come to later when we talk about the applications. As well as understanding child development generally, I think the biggest thing that Launchpad gives you that sits across all of its different applications is the ability to identify children's gaps, that gap identification capability. I think in schools in particular, but across the EYFS, we're under huge pressure to close children's gaps, be they gender gaps, be they COVID gaps, be they pupil premium and deprivation gaps. But it's very difficult to do all of these things systematically and thoroughly unless we have some kind of gap identification tool, but also we also need to understand the incremental process that gap closing would involve. So of course, Launchpad can be used for that general child development CPD. Of course it can, but I think where it really comes into its own and the main way most people use it is as a gap identification and a gap closing toolkit. As well as identifying those gaps, we are able to work out by going back what a child can do. So it's no use saying, oh, that child's got a gap with vocabulary, or oh, that child's got a gap with auditory memory for understanding. That child's got a gap with sequential auditory memory. No wonder they can't blend. It's a very little use just to say they've got a gap with that, unless we clarify and quantify that gap. So in the gap identification process, we realise that there is a mismatch between what the child should be able to do and what the child can actually do. But we also are able to, because we've got that incremental understanding through the Launchpad skills framework, we're able to go back and find out what the child's level of success is with that skill. What can they do? How far back down that developmental grid do I have to go with that skill until I get a, yes, they can do that? And that is what I call level of success, which is crucial, because from that level of success, with that incremental understanding that the skills framework gives me, I can understand that incremental process, that step-by-step journey that a child needs to take in order to work towards age-related expectations. So I can think about what process gap closing needs to be. So as we'll see in kind of future applications, what I don't want to keep doing in order to try and make that child make progress is to keep trying to get them to do something that they simply can't do because they haven't got the skills to underpin it. What I need to be able to do is understand the skill gap that's acting as a barrier to that, and then work them towards a point where they can do that. And also by having that incremental progression, we can ensure that all of our children are making progress. They're working towards what we want them to do, and we can document it and make sure that all of our children are making progress because we're targeting their next steps. So we are being aspirational for these children, but we're being aspirational in a developmentally appropriate way in order to ensure progression. And by going back and building is the fastest way that we can facilitate progress with children. Once we've done that kind of gap identification and we understand what next steps are, whether it be for phonics, whether it be for speech, language and communication, we'll talk about those applications in a moment. The emphasis of Launchpad is about embedding interventions into our targeted practice, embedding gap closing opportunities into our teaching and learning process, and using quality first teaching to embed all of these things. So of course, Launchpad can be used to take a group of children who have a commonality of next step and to plan some activities around facilitating and moving those children onto that next step. Of course it could. And that could be seen as an intervention group, or it could be seen as a phonic planning group, phonic preparation group. So of course it can be used as a planning tool. But when we're thinking about moving children onto next steps, the toolkit and the CPD and the supporting documents within it advocate more of an approach of embedding interventions and embedding gap closing into the give and take of everything that we do. And certainly in the early years, we talk about layers of practice, interactions, how we use our learning environment, as well as the little focused activities that we might carry out with children. So as I said right at the beginning, we see that Launchpad is the antithesis of an isolated intervention program. So in terms of offering you support, of course, there is support around that gap identification and next step setting process. The Launchpad skills framework will allow you to do that as well. But there is additional CPD in the toolkit, not just about gap identification and next step setting, but about how to put things in place in order to move children on. And if you have been to the previous 3 sessions in this CPD, if you went back and revisited those 3 sessions, once you had a Launchpad toolkit, if you were to get one, then you can see that you would be thinking about some of those messages in this generic training that we've offered through St Wilfrid's with just a slightly different mindset. So a lot of people who have attended these 3 sessions through St Wilfrid's have actually been Launchpad toolkit users as well, but they're thinking about it in a much more specific way. So you've got CPD, a whole bank of CPD that I keep adding to over time. And in terms of that, you just basically buy the Launchpad toolkit once. It's a one-off fee. You get everything you need. You get your login, you get your skills framework poster, you get access to the CPD. That's all woven into it. So the idea is that it's a toolkit, a self-sustaining toolkit, where it's got the CPD in it that you need. Leaders can use the CPD with their teams. So you're not going to be hit with a resource where every year you've got a subscription fee. It's a one-off fee, and it's £495. I think that's important to say. And you're also not going to be hit with a resource where you buy the resources and then before you know it, you've got to find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of extra pounds to send your staff on CPD. It's really, my ethos is about creating a sustainable solution for addressing these issues and a sustainable toolkit for schools. And the other important thing to know about Launchpad is that when we look at those supporting documents and when we look at CPD, Launchpad kind of says, well, once you understand and once you know a little bit more about your children's gaps, the first thing that you should do before you start kind of saying, oh, what does Kirstie say we should do about that, is you should reflect on your current practice. What do we do already? What have we got in place already? Launchpad is about building on your current good practice, keeping what is strong already, but then thinking, right, okay, now I know a little bit more about my children's gaps. Where might I need to go back a bit for some children? Where might I need to tweak things just a bit? Where might I need to, I'm working on that skill, but maybe I need to do a bit more of that in different ways. Now I know that that's a gap for quite a few of my children. And maybe sometimes what do I need to add into my practice? Because actually we don't specifically target that skill, but now I realize that that's really important. Maybe we should bring that in. So really Launchpad is about reflecting on, tweaking and evolving your practice from its current starting point. It's not about stopping doing what you're doing already and then doing it the Launchpad way. It's not like that at all. And it's also not about saying, this is what we do, and then suddenly we've got to find extra time and extra ways of squishing this new program in to our already crammed and busy timetable. It's not about that. Launchpad is really more about having a way of identifying those gaps and setting next steps, but it's more like a toolkit to have as a thought process and a decision making about your children and what they need and what your practice needs to look like, so that you're using your current practice, you're using the resources that you've already got, but you're using them in a really targeted and systematic way to close children's gaps. And the other thing, I suppose, whilst we're talking about costs as well, is, of course, if your school wanted to employ 2 extra people and put them into your nursery so that they could interact with your target children and work on their next steps, then of course you can do that, and Launchpad will help you. And certainly Launchpad will help you if any children get additional support because of their more specific and significant needs. But although Launchpad involves an upskilling process, the delivery of Launchpad can be carried out with your existing team. It doesn't need additional staffing unless you want to put additional staffing into a year group. It's not about, like some of these isolated intervention programs where you think, right, okay, we're going to do that, but who's going to do it? And, you know, you've got to find a member of staff who can come down for half the morning or the full morning to work with these different groups and take them out. And really that's very difficult for schools to sustain that level of staffing. But also when that adult is busy taking all of those children out, we have to also ask the question, what is not being done with the other children when that adult is out of the room? And I think ultimately it is a toolkit to upskill individual teachers, and it's a toolkit to upskill our wider team and our wider support staff. And certainly you need to bring your whole team along for the ride. One person cannot deliver Launchpad. Certain people can lead on it, that's fine. But in essence, I think Launchpad is also a toolkit for leaders, be they leaders within a multi-academy trust, be they leaders within a local authority, or be they leaders within a school leadership team, to kind of say, what is our priority? Okay, we're going to think about getting a Launchpad toolkit to help us with writing, or to help us with phonics, because that's our priority, or to help us with speech, language and communication. We'll look at these applications in a moment. But what's really important, I think, is that as leaders, people have a sense of, why are you getting Launchpad? You know, what do you want to use it for? What do you want it to help you with? And I always say Launchpad should be taken on by a school to do something that they're already doing, or to do something that they're wanting to do anyway. But what it does is it upskills you to do that in a more thorough and systematic way, and mainly to understand the gaps that are acting as barriers to your children's writing, phonics, speech, language and communication, whatever you choose to focus on. And I think that's really important, that Launchpad shouldn't be seen as an isolated, separate thing, another program, something that's different. That Launchpad is quite central to that thought process of your strategy and your approach to something, but particularly allows you to get better at it with those children with gaps and our most vulnerable children. So those children where, you know, even when what you're doing is working quite well for most of your children, why is it not working for all of your children? And that's where Launchpad would really come in and help you to unpick that. So let's talk through some of the main applications different schools prioritize with Launchpad. And I think it's got this flexibility in it. And what can happen over time is that, you know, say, for example, one multi-academy trust I've been working with for a long time, they've been using it very much to look at phonics, and now they're beginning to branch out, keeping that going, but branching out to look more at language and speech, language and communication. So these different kind of priorities or applications give you a route into Launchpad, a reason why to have it, I suppose, in the beginning. But then once you've kind of done that upskilling and you've got that application under your belt, so to speak, and once that becomes just kind of like second nature to you, and that's just what you do in your school now in relation to that, it also allows you to have that ongoing upskilling, that you can think, okay, we've got this toolkit now as a school, we can either just keep doing that and only ever do that, or we can grow with it over time. And then the documents and the CPD will be there to allow you to either just keep going with that one application or to grow with it over time. But it is useful to have a route into it first. Now, I haven't put it on this PowerPoint, but one thing that some people do is they take a developmental approach. And I'll just mention that here because I haven't put it in as a kind of standalone application, where they notice, for example, lots of their children have got issues with auditory processing, language processing. And yes, they've got other children with gaps elsewhere on the Launchpad skills framework, but they've got big chunks of their cohort who are not meeting age-related expectations, where this is a skill area where lots of the children are not meeting age-related expectations. And sometimes, and this kind of overlaps with these different applications, sometimes a school or a group of schools, if they're working together, will say, do you know what we're going to do? We're going to look at this skill and this skill first. And we're going to look at our children in relation to that skill. We're going to think about our current practice in relation to that skill. We're going to think about how our children and our current practice correlates. And then we're going to think about how we can make our practice more targeted and more specific. Then, once we've kind of done all of that, and once that kind of upskilling dust has settled, we'll move on to another chunk. So as leaders, you're in control of Launchpad. There is no right way, there's no one way to do it. It's about what works for you and what works you towards a point of upskilling and a point of matching your practice in a targeted way to the gaps that your children have. More broadly, a lot of people choose to take on Launchpad to look at children's speech, language and communication development. We already know that an understanding and a grounding in child development, but particularly speech, language and communication, is crucial to our EYFS team. I think it's crucial beyond EYFS. And that, you know, people like Julian Grenier were saying, you know, you must understand child development, particularly speech, language and communication. It must be central to our early years curriculum. So people say all these things and they're saying things that are right, but Launchpad would give you that edge because it breaks it all down and there's lots of CPD within it. If you wanted to do additional CPD, such as Elkland, such as Hannon, if you've done it already or you want to do it alongside, Launchpad isn't going to disagree with any of that. They would all just complement and work together really well. But what Launchpad would give you, which those other things wouldn't, would be that ability to drill down and identify the gaps in your children. Although it can support us for all children in relation to speech, language and communication, it particularly helps us where children are not meeting age-related expectations. And this morning, I've just been recording some more CPD on this and kind of making sure that people have a very structured index for this application. And, you know, and already in the EYFS, we're supposed to know who those children are who are not meeting age-related expectations. What do they need? And if the powers that be or Ofsted came around and spoke to any members of my team, we're supposed to be able to tell you what are we putting in place for those children who are not meeting age-related expectations to move them towards age-related expectations. So we're supposed to be doing that already. This isn't a Launchpad thing. This isn't a new thing. This is an expectation for all of us. All I'm saying is that having the Launchpad toolkit would help you to do that thing that you're supposed to be doing in it already, but in a more systematic, thorough and targeted way. We're already, I suppose, within that, supposed to also know who's got more. So we've got loads of children who are not meeting age-related expectations. Who's got more specific? Who's got significant needs? Who do I need to refer? Who should I not refer? Who can I deal with in-house? And when I do refer, what information should I put on those referrals when I'm having discussions with people from outside agencies? You know, so these are all things, again, that we are having to do and needing to do. But Launchpad will really to help us to do that. And where Launchpad is used in some areas really extensively, we're beginning to weave Launchpad into the speech and language referral process so that the speech and language therapist department are able to say, look, we need to see the children that we need to see. You need to use Launchpad with them as well. But actually, we don't need to see all those other children, even though they're not meeting age-related expectations, because they're not a clinical concern. And if you've got Launchpad in your setting or in your school, we're not going to tell you to do anything different. So my background is speech and language therapy. So I suppose what I am trying to do by giving you Launchpad is to put that gap identification capability, but also that ability to embed those strategies and those principles into your practice, but whilst working as teachers and practitioners. So Launchpad would really help you with that. And I think when it comes to speech and language, and in the training that I recorded this morning, and I suppose it's a little bit like what we talked about in session 1 for St. Wilfrid's, but more specifically, we take you through this kind of skill flow assessment process where we understand that skills are built on skills, and some speech and language skills are more fundamental than others. And we work towards a point where we can identify what is the main skill gap, or what are the main couple of skill gaps that are acting as a barrier for this child, the main reason why they're not moving towards age-related expectations, and where is it that me and my team need to put our embedded intervention efforts. And where there are gaps, drill back down, what can the child do, set next steps, and then what can we put in place. So again, a lot of the principles that we've talked about through this St. Wilfrid's training in a very general way, Launchpad would really allow you to unpick that and to really specify those gaps and those next steps and the specific areas that you needed to work on. And I think, Launchpad can sit alongside an isolated intervention program. So if you've already got Nelly in place, and if you're happy with it, if you've already got something like I Can Early Talk Boost in place and you're happy with it, there's no reason why you can't do both. They're very different. Launchpad is more about what's happening outside of that group, what's happening once that group ends, or what's happening with those children who haven't been chosen to go in that group. But in my humble opinion, if you get your practice right with these children, we don't need these isolated intervention programs. That's my opinion. I think we reach for them because we want to help, and we reach for them because we haven't got that gap identification capability. So we kind of go to a program to give us something to do to help. In my opinion, if we upskill ourselves to have that, I don't think we need these things. And like I said before, where children do have more significant and specific concerns, where they have been allocated some extra adult time through an EHCP, for example, I think we really need to be saying every minute that adult is with that child, what are they doing? What are they working on? How are we making sure that adult is interacting with that child in the right way? How do we make sure that they're working on the next steps? How are we making sure that, whether it be through interactions, through targeted use of the learning environment, through carrying out some little activities, and a combination of all of these three things, that adult time is being used thoroughly and well, and as the child makes progress, we move that child on to the next level. I think that's so important, that adult has a clear sense of what they're doing to support that child, and we can use Launchpad for that. Obviously, there'll need to be leadership direction with that, but we can use Launchpad for that. So yeah, speech, language and communication. And I suppose that's kind of where the whole idea of Launchpad came from in some respects, because of my background as a speech and language therapist, but also when I first started talking to people about the principle of Launchpad, it was actually when I was running some training many moons back with a fabulous lady called Anne Foster, who was a literacy consultant, and we used to run a course about phonic readiness together. And that's where kind of the framework of Launchpad also began to bubble to the surface. And we looked at what skills children needed to be ready for phonics and what would be the incremental order of that. And it was a very broad, very skeleton type framework, which has evolved into the Launchpad skills framework as it is now. And all of that content about phonic readiness phonic skills that are needed to be facilitated through preparation, skills that children need to be ready, and skills that will underpin ongoing phonic progression are still within Launchpad. So other schools, multi-academy trusts, whole local authorities will say, right, okay, with my school or with our schools, we're going to have Launchpad and we really want to use it to target the phonic application. And it will do that for you as well. So this is where, as a leader, you've got to have that sense of direction, but you are in control of that. So let's just explore that in a little bit about what that would mean. So if we think about Launchpad, there's lots and lots of different developmental skills on it, but through the CPD, we can clarify which of those skills feed directly into phonic readiness and which are really important, but don't feed as directly into phonic readiness, so that maybe within our strategy, we can focus on those skills and leave the others till later. And even narrow it down so that these skills feed more into phonic reading and these skills feed more into phonic writing. So again, you can chunk it a bit more depending on your priorities and depending on how much you want to take on in one time. And also, if we understand the skills framework, we can say with these skills, when the children get to this level, and for any of you who have seen the Launchpad skills framework, it will be when they get to the top of the yellow on the skills framework, that would equate to them being ready. So we talk a lot about preparation, we talk about ready, not ready, but Launchpad helps us to clarify and quantify what actually ready means, what holistically set of skills does it involve, and what level exactly of those skills do children need to be ready, so that we can make better judgments about our preparation, but better judgments about whether children are ready or not. And so in nursery, again, I embrace my current practice. I don't, stop doing everything that I've done before, but I begin to consider a wider set of skills, such as conceptual understanding, which might not have been part of my literacy preparation diet before. I begin to consider things like sequential auditory memory. So I broaden it out, but I also think about, what do I do already? And go, this is my point of readiness, but this is where most of my children are now. How am I going to get as many children to that point as possible, bearing in mind their differing starting points? And when I've got children who are not meeting age-related expectations, when I've got children with gaps with these skills, how do I take that into consideration? How do I go back and build in order to make sure that not only these children are making progress, but my literacy preparation also incorporates gap closing as well, rather than just ignoring the gaps? So I'm building on current practice. I've got that kind of really holistic idea about what literacy readiness actually is, that it's not just a bit of listening and a bit of phonological awareness. We need a much broader set of skills, really. And I'm moving away from this one size fits all phonic preparation diet, where I do this activity, this other activity with all of my children, and then, hey presto, they'll all be ready. Or, our SSPs now have nursery offers where it's like, do this with all of your children and it will get them all ready. And the delivery of Launchpad is just basic early years practice, but it requires a little bit more complex thought than just do this, do that, and then they'll all be ready. It's, how do I get my children with gaps ready, and how do I kind of move my children who are meeting age-related expectations on, but making sure that they have that firm level of readiness as well. In reception, when children are not ready, and you're saying they're not ready, you're probably right. But Launchpad allows me to clarify and quantify what that not readiness looks and sounds like. So for those skills strands that feed directly into phonic readiness, chances are they're not at the top of the yellow. with some of those skill strands. It might be that they're not at the top of the yellow with any of those skill strands. But if they're not, how far back do you have to go before that you get that yes? And therefore, what would be their next step? So that I have a clear idea about what I need to do to work that child towards readiness. And although there will be some children with really specific and significant needs where you have a legitimate case for saying there is no point the child sitting in on this SSP because they are so not ready. For most children, Launchpad would be talking about underpinning your SSP in nursery and then sitting alongside your SSP in reception and onwards. So for most children who are not ready, we would be looking at incorporating gap closing opportunities into our holistic EYFS practice, weaving it into the wider curriculum alongside my SSP. But I would probably, and I would be the one that would be advocating that within my interventions, I want to also be doing some gap closing activities. That what I don't want to be doing is just more and more flashcards or more and more magnetic letters. That if I'm understanding that these gaps are the reasons why this child's not blending, or this gap is the reason why this child can't retain any more than 10 letters, then I need to be doing something about that and resist jumping into that cycle of just doing more and more of the same in the hope that that works. And then obviously that readiness is about phonic progression, but it's also just about phonic learning. But there'll be other children, for example, who we thought were ready but have issues with phonic progression. They were doing okay with phoneme grapheme correspondence, but they're still not blending. We've got children in year 1 who are down for not going to get through the phonic screening check. And again, Launchpad would allow me to troubleshoot those children and to look at the barriers. Why is that child not able to blend? Why is that child struggling with phoneme grapheme correspondence? Why is that child able to segment a word, but then not actually be able to write it down? What are the skill gaps that are acting as barriers? Because we teach an SSP, we teach it consistently and well, and it's working for most of my children. Why is it not working for this child? And the reason is because the child will have a skill gap or a couple of skill gaps or a lot of skill gaps for some children that are acting as barriers and that I need to find out about and do something about rather than just ignoring them. So again, for people in year 1, if I had children who were down on my list of not down for getting through the phonic screening check, I would be coming in there, if I hadn't done already with Launchpad, looking at why they weren't blending, or what is it that I'm going to spend the next 4 or 5 months pushing? Am I going to just do more and more of the same, or am I going to go back and build? And so really, like I said before, Launchpad allows us to find out the reasons why and to incorporate gap closing in order to remove those barriers and to move away from this belief that just keeping doing more and more of the same is going to somehow work this time. And I think that's really kind of what Launchpad for this application is all about. And some people would say, oh, you can't do that. And I will always say, well, is what you're doing at the minute working for that child? And for so many children will go, well, no, not really. And it's like, well, why are we still doing that then? So it's not about stopping your SSP. It's not about being against your SSP. It's about actually working on skills that will allow your SSP to be successful with that child. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but Launchpad could also be used by your school to support and underpin your strategy for writing. So a multi-academy trust who are just taking on Launchpad at the minute, they want to have a writing focus. And again, even within that, we can break it down. You've got phonic writing, you've got the mechanics and the motor elements of writing, and then you've got the language base of writing. Writing is vast, writing is complex. Are you going to look at all of that, or are you going to chunk it and look at one element of writing first. And Launchpad will give you that flexibility. Again, with reading, we've talked about phonic reading, but we've got word level reading, which usually are visual issues. And then, of course, we've got language and comprehension. So again, a Launchpad can help you to look at those language skills that feed into reading comprehension. And as an ex-speech and language therapist, that's one of my bugbears, to be honest, that so many children in Key Stage 1 get labelled as having reading comprehension issues, and they do have issues with reading comprehension, you're not wrong, but that they actually have language skill gaps, which they've had all along, and which are evident when you talk to those children or when you play language games with those children. It's just we've never measured that skill until it hit reading. And so again, Launchpad will allow us to think about what our preparation for reading comprehension needs to look like before they get to that point, but also what are the skills that individual older children are missing and how can we build those. So I suppose within all of this, we've got that principle of Launchpad being a bottom-up approach. Really the emphasis is on early years and identifying and tackling gaps as soon as possible, having that notion of really thorough and holistic preparation because we understand more about what our children will need to be ready for different things. But then for those older children, it is about, right, okay, what is it that's so ideally as more children come through, they'll have less gaps. Where they still have gaps, we'll know more about what those gaps are and what they need before it becomes a problem. So it can be used for older children as well, but ideally as a school, you want to have it as a bottom-up approach rather than always being used to firefight with older children. So you need both, but the bottom-up is the way to go. So just a couple of things. Of course, we can use it to unpick children who have got issues with wider learnings. Most of these children will have more specific and significant needs. I hate the term, but Ofsted will call a certain group of children our lowest 20%. For some schools, they say we don't have a 20%, we have a 50%. It depends on you. But again, I don't like the term. But again, why are those children struggling to learn and retain? Why is Ofsted classifying that child as being in your lowest 20%? It will be because of developmental skill gaps that child has, but as well as having gaps, often, particularly if they've got more specific and significant needs, they might have skill strengths. So if we're looking at those children, what do they need? How are we going to ensure that they make progress? Then the more we can build a skill profile, find out about their gaps, close their gaps, but also where there are strengths, utilize those strengths to support those gaps and to support their learning, the more we can ensure that these children are making progress, and the more we can really be quite confident that we know what these children need. Again, if we're thinking about children where our concerns are mainly personal, social and emotional development or behaviour, again, Launchpad can really support us with this. In my opinion, certainly in the early years, probably 96–97% of children who exhibit behavioural needs in the early years, it's actually due to a communication or language-based problem. So we need to be looking at, for these children, not just how do we manage their behaviour and reward good behaviour, we've got to look at that as well, of course, but how do we look at their skills, the reason why their behaviour is like this, and it might be that their play skills aren't developed enough to cope with our learning environment. It might be that their awareness of other people and other people's needs to be targeted. Do they know how to take turns? Do they even know that the other children are also there and are also people? Sometimes we have to go back as far as that. But also as well, what's their understanding of language like? So as we talk to that child and as we manage their behaviour, we know how to add language, whether we can use short, simple chunk sentences, or whether we can say a little bit more. These are all things I need to know in order to move a child on so that in the future those behavioural incidences lessen, but also so that I know how to interact and talk with that child to support their language, but also to get my message across. These are essential things. So rounding it off so that we make sure that we've got plenty of time at the end in order to kind of answer any questions or to field any comments, is just to kind of reiterate, if I haven't done already, that it is a really flexible toolkit and that you are in control of how you use it, what you use it for, and you know, it's not going to be a program that you have to squish in and has to be delivered in a certain way, where your staff follow a script, where you have to do it this way, and it's like it's the opposite of that. And that flexibility means that you have to have that leadership and that sense of direction behind it, but it also gives you that ability to grow with it over time and to make sure that what you're doing matches your children and matches the needs of your children and your school, rather than you trying to squish into the needs of a program. It's the opposite way round. As I've said before, Launchpad works the best and we can get really good outcomes for children. And I'm not saying this because it's Launchpad, and I'm not saying it's... Launchpad is simply child development. So I don't even say I wrote... Well, I did theoretically write Launchpad, but really what I did was I pulled Launchpad together. Launchpad is just really underpinned by child developmental principles. So if we buy into its ethos and if leadership drive it, it can have really significant impact for children, for our attainment, for levels of progression, particularly with our most vulnerable children, simply because it can't not work, because it's child development. But it needs that belief in its ethos and that leadership drive behind it. It definitely does. So again, as people thinking about, do we want this? Do we, you know, you have to understand that right from the beginning. And, you know, you can't have the outcomes from Launchpad just by sticking the poster on the wall. You know, you have to kind of go through that commitment to upskilling your leaders, to upskilling your wider teams, and to feel that for your school, this is the right way to go. And the last line that I've put there, and I think this is a lovely phrase, is it's not a sticking plaster. So when I think about things like Nellie, you know, no offense to Nellie, but in my opinion, I know this has been recorded, but I'm just going to say it. It's fine, but to me, it's a sticking plaster. We've got a massive issue with speech, language, and communication development. We've got a massive issue with huge numbers of children not meeting age-related expectations. So we'll put something into schools that is not easy to put in, but it's relatively simplistic, because we just give them a set of session plans, we give them a set of resources, we have to train up a couple of teaching assistants in order to deliver it, and then we can tick a box. But it's not getting to the root of the issue, which is about weaving gap identification and gap closing into the teaching and learning process, and to flip the notion of what an intervention is, that an intervention can't be something separate and isolated when we've got this number of children who are presenting with skill gaps. So for me, Launchpad is not a quick fix. It's not a sticking plaster, but it's that long-term sustainable approach to face these issues and to give a wider number of children and a wider range of children, because we've got lots of children, again, with really quite significant needs in our schools now as well, more than we used to upskill ourselves to deal with that number and that range of children. whilst also working in a system that is very mindful about progression and attainment. And Launchpad gives you a way of trying to juggle all of that. And that's probably all I want to say. I'm sure people will want more specific detail, but probably the best thing for me to do now is to come out of this